Welcome, everyone, to the webinar on Startup Express Licensing. I'm Kirsten Loita of Osage University Partners. I'll be your moderator today for our webinar, as well as presenting some slides from a survey OUP conducted of institutions with Startup Express licenses. I'm going to start off by having our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. Kelly, could you give us a brief background on yourself?
Sure. My name is Kelly Parsons. I'm the Associate Director of the Office of Technology Commercialization at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm a microbiologist, immunologist by training, and I joined the Office of Technology Commercialization in 2008.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly. Ken?
Hi, I'm Ken Porter. I'm Director of UM Ventures College Park at the University of Maryland, and I've been here about a year and come from Innovate Calgary that served the University of Calgary in Alberta. So have experience at both places with express licenses, and I'm a real believer in them.
Great. So glad you can join us, Ken. John?
Sure. I'm John Puziss. I'm Director of Business Development in the Office of Cooperative Research at Yale. And like Kelly, I'm also a microbiologist and immunologist. I've been in the private sector for about 6 years in biotech and pharma prior to coming to Yale.
Great. Well, I'm so glad that all of you could join us today and share your experiences on Startup Express licenses. For our audience, we wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and both the slides and the recording will be available on OUP's partner portal within a couple of days. We will not be posting this particular webinar on OUP's YouTube channel, where you found a lot of our previous webinars. If you want to view this webinar or the slides, you can go to the portal. The portal address is easy to remember. It's portal.oup.bc. For those of you who are not familiar with the partner portal, this is our new online platform that contains resources on licensing startups and other OUP programs. And if you have any questions about the portal, you can go ahead and contact Natasha Azar or Jamie Testai. You can see their email addresses here. So feel free to do that. And finally, before we get to the survey results, as we're going through this webinar today, if you have any questions for our panelists, please ask them through the Q&A box that you can see either at the top or the bottom of your screen in the Zoom app. Our panelists can see the questions and we'll answer them as we can. Okay, so first we're going to get them to our survey that we conducted. Let's set up exactly what types of licenses we're talking about here. These are licenses for startup companies with set financial terms and other terms that are supposed to be fast and easy to execute to get the startup quickly on its ways. Last year, OUP conducted a survey of institutions on these set up startup license agreement and practices. We'll spend out the next 10 minutes going through these survey results, and I really encourage our panelists to chime in as we go through some of the questions and the results that came up with this. So as a bit of background, this survey was distributed to 16 universities. 10 of those universities participated, and we did this analysis back then in September. So the first question we asked all of the institutions was, how long have you actually had these types of agreements? And so you can see here that they varied anywhere between 0 to just over 10 years. I think we know which one was the over 10 years respondent. Not pointing fingers here.
No.
Right. But Kelly can talk about her experience a little bit more since they've been doing this for quite a long time. But then we also asked them how many licenses they've done during their program, not just since the beginning of the license, but also in the past 2 years to kind of see has there been an uptick over time and how have these been adopted. And you can see what the results are here, that basically people had done anywhere between 1 and over 30 licenses through these programs. Obviously, those who had had the program for less time had fewer licenses, and then it increases over time. Next slide. We asked people if their startup terms and express licenses had a particular industry focus. 4 of them responded no, but the other 6 said yes. One of them was software only. The yes others then had other responses, such as that they had different versions for therapeutics and physical sciences, software assets, diagnostics, or everything else.
So Yale specifically excludes therapeutics, although we will include anything else.
Okay, good. Any other comments, Ken and Kelly, on that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. We also asked them whether their financial terms in this express license were take it or leave it. 8 out of 10 of them said that it was take it or leave it. 2 of them said they were negotiable. And then along those same lines, we also asked them about the non-financial terms in the license, whether those were take it or leave it. 7 out of 10 of them said it was also take it or leave it. Kelly, Ken, and John, do you want to talk about your practices with the take it or leave it?
Sure, I'll start. So at Yale, it's both the financial and non-financial terms are take it or leave it, non-negotiable. Although at the outset, when we are working with the startup to create the license, we'll basically insert a field of use. And then depending on the type of technology and industry that the license is for, the royalty rate will vary.
So this is Kelly from UNC. For us, the only thing that is negotiable within our express license are the due diligence milestones for that particular technology. Everything else is take it or leave it. And we found that to be very critical for the success of the express license here. If a company founders are insistent on other terms, then our stance is that we will go back to our standard agreement that we would negotiate with any company, outside company, and we'll negotiate from scratch, but we will not modify the express license.
This is Ken. Ours is not take it or leave it, but we try to have all of the non-financial terms the least, or at the lowest, the least stringent terms that we can accept. So there's really no room for negotiation. There maybe on things like the periods of reporting can be adjusted depending on the business model, but very few things are. We include things that are that we really can't negotiate on.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you all for your comments on those. We'll move on to the next slide then. We asked the institutions what was the typical expected time then for this type of license to actually be completed. You can see that the vast majority of the institutions said 2 to 4 weeks. One was slightly less, one was somewhat more. You'll notice that although we had 10 respondents here, not all of the respondents responded to every single survey question, so we only had 9 respondents to this particular question. But most people said it was 2 to 4 weeks. Does that jibe with the 3 of you on how the expected time for completion?
Yeah, so I'm going to chime in here and say that certainly ours is set up to be executed in 2 to 4 weeks. However, and Ken and John, I'd be curious to hear experience here. You know, certainly that holds true for the license, but frankly, time to execution can be a lot longer than this because of conflict of interest review. So we find that to be typically the biggest delay of when we begin the process to execution is waiting for that okay from our conflict of interest office.
I think for us it is in the 2 to 4 week range, and because it's non-negotiable, it's really kind of walking the startup team through it, and then oftentimes we might have it fully negotiated, but we're not going to execute it until they actually have a financing, because once our license is executed, it does incur some financial obligations on the licensee.
I'd have to say ours is always longer, and it because we're not take it or leave it, and some of the wordplay, the legal wordplay gets involved in the negotiation. It's usually longer than 2 months.
Terrific. Okay. And John and Ken, conflict of interest also, since Kelly mentioned that that's often the delay. Do any have any comments on that?
Yeah. So one of the reasons we started our startup license program, or express license, whatever you want to call it, is because oftentimes we were licensing to teams that included faculty or a student or both as founders. And so we basically walk them through their obligations to disclose to the university the fact that they now have an interest in a startup company, that there is potentially a conflict. But the university doesn't need to review it in advance of execution of the license, but they are expected to, to disclose this to the university and then to comply with any management plan.
Mm-hmm.
For us, not conflict of interest, but we do a lot of hand-holding, a lot of support for our early-stage companies, helping them find space and helping them find funding and all of that, especially if we find space for them. We have incubators on campus and facilities use agreements and facilities use licenses. 6 months is the minimum to get those done because they have to go through occupational safety and all kinds of other approvals besides our office.
Well, thank you for all of those insights. I think that helps people understand a little bit about the timing, still the timing aspects that are associated even with an express license. All right, we can go to the next. We did ask the institutions whether these had in practice then sped up the time to complete the transaction. All of them said absolutely yes. We didn't dig more into this, but that is probably an area that we can talk about a little bit more after we get through these slides with our panelists. We also asked about administrative effort. So there is obviously, as all of you who are on this webinar know, there is the actual license negotiation aspect of this, but then there's the administrative part of doing these licenses as well, and whether that also took a reduced amount of efforts to have with these startup express licenses. 7 out of 10 of them said that effort had also been reduced. And I don't know if actually any of our panelists were the ones who said no, that it hadn't. I was just curious what the comments might be about on these administrative efforts, whether that was something that was unexpected.
Yeah, our experience is that it has dramatically reduced the administrative effort required to license and dramatically reduced the time. And I think we're also seeing an uptick in the number of startups that we're doing because of implementing this program.
Sure. Another question that we asked all the survey respondents was the rate of adoption of these set-term startup or express licenses by the startups in their communities. You can see that the responses varied widely. 2 of the respondents said poorly, 3 felt it was kind of middling, and then 5 good or excellent. So one of the things that we were also asking about later in this survey was what they would do differently or about rate of adoption. So we can move on to the next slide. We also asked them about whether they'd surveyed, evaluated within their community the satisfaction with their particular program. None of them had done yet a formal satisfaction survey, so mostly what they had were anecdotes about the programs themselves. A lot of them had surveyed the communities prior to the introduction of the programs, but not afterwards. And I think, Kelly, you were looking at doing something like this, right?
Well, maybe we can get into this a little bit more later. I think we are thinking about a process, some kind of ongoing review process to update the express license periodically. So certainly maybe not necessarily a pure-cut satisfaction survey, but maybe more of a line process with the key stakeholders of how we're going to think about royalties ongoing with markets and other things. So we can touch back on that later, but I think that's the direction we're headed.
Okay, great. All right. And we do see that we have a question from the audience. We will answer that question in a little bit. In the meantime, we wanted to get through the rest of these slides before we get to the panelist questions. What have been some, if any, difficult factors for adoption on these programs? Again, this is the survey respondents talking back to us here. A lot of people talked about how it is really difficult for people not to negotiate. Just taking a license agreement and not negotiating it was really difficult for many people they were trying to get these startup licenses done with. Another factor that people cited, I think more than once, was lack of knowledge and education around their communities and to the founders and the faculty about this process and the programs themselves. there was this continuing concern that copyright and software IP and those startups are still difficult. Even with these types of programs, these programs in some cases were trying to solve some of the issues around the copyright and software IP environments, but those still remain a challenge. We already talked about no negotiation by all entities, but also the last point that someone made was that they had certain startups that could qualify for these types of programs, the term startup license programs, but there were some startups that would not qualify, would not fall under the guidelines then for these particular programs. So that was a difficult factor for adoption for them. We can go on. We also asked them about when, there were actual discussions about the startup licenses, either getting them signed in the first place. What were the most contested areas then when they actually did negotiate parts of it? And Kelly had already mentioned about the diligence and the milestones, but other areas that people brought up were patent cost reimbursement, that's been a difficult contested area within these licenses, equity, diligence obligations, we already mentioned those, and then of course sublicensing and how sublicensing works, which is a contested area in general, I think, in the exclusive licenses, but also with these as well.
Kirsten, if I could say a word.
Absolutely.
Kind of combining the last two slides as far as the the number of the degree of negotiation for the folks that can't not negotiate. We found that as we moved from custom licenses for all the startups to a standard approach, there's still 20-page license agreements, but we went from dozens of red lines typically for a first draft to less than a dozen red lines on average for a startup, and I would like to, ask the other panelists, when you have more of a take it or leave it approach, does that mean not a single red line?
Not a single red line.
Yeah. So what we tell our startup teams is that it's non-negotiable, and if you go and take it to outside counsel and they come back with lots of red lines, we essentially tear this up and then we start from scratch, and then the terms are not going to be as favorable to your company.
Yeah, I guess I would say too that word travels and people talk, right? And I think that was one of the things we did correctly when we started this 10 years ago, was that we held very firm to the fact that we weren't going to negotiate. And when we had folks, to kind of John's point, we had folks come in and say, oh, no, but we don't want this clause, or we don't want this. I said, all right, we're going to our standard license. And after they took a look at what was on the table in that situation, they very quickly ran back to the express license and said, we'll happily sign it. Certainly there are exceptions of times when, for one reason or another, we all agreed that the express license wasn't the way to go. But I think just kind of standing firm and consistent up front really set the tone that people know that we're not going to be moved, that either they're going to sign the license the way it is or we can negotiate a standard agreement. And that does save us a lot of back and forth or people trying to negotiate bits and parts.
Great. Well, I think that's really helpful for everyone to hear. And Ken, thanks for asking the question. So getting to actually, I think, one of Kelly's points earlier about whether we asked people whether they had actually iterated to a new version over time of their licenses. Most of them said they had actually stayed with their original version, but that 3 of them had iterated to a new version of the license. And I think that part of that just may actually be due with the length of time that they've had their license around and whether they've had that opportunity to do so. We also asked them if they had a standard process for reviewing and updating their terms of their set term startup or express license. 9 out of 10 of them said that they didn't actually have that process in place, but you will see, I think from some of the comments later, that they wish that there was something that they had thought of ahead of time, that they would have perhaps a timeline when they would actually potentially do that in the future. So this goes to that next question. If you could start over, how would you change or amend your set term startup or express license? One of the respondents said they would really try to do more community buy-in, which Kelly, I think also goes to another point that you had, that you really worked with your local community then on the license itself. And I think it's pretty important for people to know that getting community buy-in, both internally at the university as well as externally with the community you're going to work with is crucial for actually getting this implemented and adopted. Another group said that they would like to include milestone payments in the Express license. They hadn't done that originally, and actually I think one of the next slides is actually an overview of the financial terms in these licenses. We'll get to those. Incorporate a regular review process. We just talked about that. Another person said they would consider how the low rates in these Startup Express licenses would affect other licenses, that they were getting a lot of pushback on their other licenses because of the terms that were in this particular startup license. And then the last two were about equity. One has said they would have an equity rather than an exit fee, and we'll see on the next slide about those as well. And then have either a choice between equity or royalties. Another respondent said they would have done something around that. Any comments from any of you on any of these? I know we're going to get more into this as we talk about the challenges. All right, we'll move on to the next slide, which is the financial terms overview of these different licenses. I'm just going to run through these really quickly. We'll actually return to this slide as we're actually asking the panelists questions so that people can just see this as we're talking. But just to run through, nine of the 10 respondents were provided this overview of their Express license terms. You can see just going down the list that none of these Express licenses have an upfront fee associated with them. And then if you look at the exit or the equity and the exit/success fees, you can see that if the Startup Express license included equity, it did not have an exit or a success fee, or if it had an exit or success fee, it did not have equity in the license. The royalties varied quite a bit between these different licenses, from anywhere from 0 to 3%. And annual minimum royalties, the next column, most of the licenses did not have these, but a couple of them did. And you can see, for example, for number 8, they did in the cases where it was not software.
So Kirsten, I think for annual minimum royalties, I assume that means after a first sale is made?
After a first sale, that's
okay,
right. Right, so they're not maintenance fees. The maintenance fees are the next ones, and you can see that, again, this varies. Most institutions don't have maintenance fees, but some did. And then milestones, almost none of the Startup licenses had milestones associated with them, except for one had it, therapeutics associated licenses. And then sub-licenses, anywhere from 0 to 35%, and some of them had it tiered, obviously. And some of this I do wonder, too, if sub-licensing wasn't allowed, or if, the cases where they were at 0, or if there was some other reason why the sub-licensing amount was 0. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts or comments on these particular financial terms at this point.
So Yale is number 6 in that slide, I believe, and so it's 3%, but depending on the type of technology. So, for example, if it is not a patented technology, but rather software or something like that, then it would be 1.5. And also, if it's a technology that's used in some other industrial process, so for example, a catalyst in a chemical synthesis, or a semiconductor that's going to be, sort of Intel inside, then it's actually 1%.
This is Ken. We take a relatively high royalty, 3%, but offer a royalty holiday in that we don't collect royalty until they're $3 million in annual sales.
Great. We have one more slide from the survey, and then we'll move on to questions. We have a number of questions from our audience, as well as other ones that we're going to pose to all of you. These were the lessons learned that people wrote in that they wanted to mention on for their own programs that they'd done, that they wanted to share potentially with others. One was, and this goes back to something else that was mentioned in another slide, was that the terms in the Startup Express license was potentially affecting their ability to negotiate on the other licenses. They weren't sure always who was the best candidate for these licensees ahead of time, and really tailoring it for who those best candidates are. Some of them found it to just be tough in practice and didn't drive their workload. The ability to negotiate was still, or the want to negotiate was still there by many of the people who were coming to the door for this one respondent. The community education is really important, and creating a primer document or some way of spreading the word and getting people on board with this was really important. Another person mentioned both the internal and external politics were kind of hard to navigate. It would be interesting to hear some of you talk about that when we talk about kind of the formation of your programs. And then it's very hard to have a one-size-fits-all startup license for your Startup Express license program, which you can see some of the people have, they've actually addressed that on the last slide by having potentially different terms to the different types of things that they're licensing out. So we're going to keep the slides on this particular slide, I think, while we address some questions. Let's go to the Q&A questions first, Kelly, Ken, and John, just to talk about some of those since they were pressing questions, and we'll also get into the kind of how your programs were founded themselves. One of the questions from Mark Odinger was, he'd asked about increasing along the lines of increased number of deals done via express license approach. Have you seen large or larger number of defaults or terminations of any of these deals, or less, or around the same? Has this affected the termination or perhaps the success of these companies and their licenses?
I would say that in Yale's experience that we have not seen an increased number of terminations, although our startup license program is not as advanced as, it hasn't been around as long, I should say, as some of the other institutions. But also our faculty or the startup teams are counseled at the very beginning not to execute until they actually have a financing ready.
So this is Kelly, and I think honestly, this question, or the answer to this question, is less directly related to UNC's Express license and more around the culture of entrepreneurship and startup companies at the university. When the Carolina Express was implemented in 2009, and the first one was signed early 2010. And that was really at the period of time that the culture, at least in Chapel Hill, was changing, and there was a real backing of support and push for faculty and students and postdocs to really start thinking about taking their technologies out into startup companies. And I think at that point in time, our office was not positioned to be as rigorous in questioning whether or not the opportunity was right for the startup or whether or not we really should consider other options. As time has gone on, we've certainly become more careful about what startups we advance and advising faculty on what may or may not make a good startup. And so certainly I think we've seen, those less than positive situations diminish. But I think, like I said, I think that's less related to the Express license and just more related to startup support and the culture here.
So I'll just give a little bit of background about Yale. So we implemented this because we were seeing an increasing number of teams that were including both faculty and students, where, say, a recent School of Management graduate would be interested in doing something entrepreneurial and starting a company based around a faculty technology. And we did not want to be in the position of having to negotiate with those students. We've had some pretty negative experiences there in the past. And so we reviewed the startup license programs from other institutions And we thought overall they tended to not be very business friendly. And so we actually sat down with outside counsel that in this case was going to represent some of these startup companies coming out of the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute. They were not Yale's clients, so they were across the table from us in this negotiation. And we negotiated a fully executed or fully negotiated license that they felt comfortable that they could take to any startup team and say that this has been negotiated in advance on their behalf and they should feel comfortable signing it. And so the financial terms, I think, as well as the non-financial terms reflect that.
So John, can I ask you a question directly?
Sure.
So it sounds like, even though you've worked through the process, that you're not moving forward with execution until that company has secured at least some level of funding.
Right.
And
so
I realize, I was just saying, I realize the climate at Yale is very different than, the climate we have in North Carolina, but, we get a lot of pushback in that they say, well, if we don't have a signed license in hand, then, an investor is not going to take us seriously or not going to be willing to engage with us. Right. What kind of dynamics have you actually seen there?
So what we usually do is we'll give the startup team an option, and then the first stage is they get an option, and then they're supposed to come back to us with a business plan that shows that they have they've put some thought into how they are going to advance the technology and create a business around it. Once they've done that and it passes the lab test, then we'll give them the startup license, which essentially is attached to the option as an exhibit, and they can go to an investor and say, look, we have rights to this technology, and upon financing, this will be signed and fully executed. They can do that in advance of a financing, but they do, as soon as it's signed, they become responsible for ongoing patent expenses. And I know there were some questions from the audience about patent expense reimbursement, so we can discuss that now, or we can.
Yeah, let's go ahead. Go ahead. There were a couple of questions on how that works, actually.
Right. So one of the things that we put in, I think this is true of any startup, not just those coming out of Yale that are using the startup license, but that is probably the number one cause of default is they fall behind on patent expenses. And so the way ours is structured is that they become responsible for ongoing expenses as of signature. They're responsible for past expenses but those are deferred, so that I think it's something like a third are due on the first anniversary, a third due on the second anniversary, and a third on the third anniversary of the effective date. We also have an incentive for them to pay on time. So you see that we have a 1% exit fee. That is reduced by up to 50% if they make payments on time. So any payment they make on time, it comes out of the exit fee.
That's an interesting model. I haven't heard of that one before.
I'm not sure that it's actually worked.
Time will tell. Time will tell. Kelly and Ken, do you want to talk about reimbursement of patent expenses? We did have a couple of questions on that and how that works under your licenses.
Sure, and perhaps I think we have a similar model that's going the other direction. I think ours might look more like a stick than a carrot, but I think it's inevitably the same thing. So the way the Carolina Express is set up is that there is a 1-year deferment of payment of patent cost with some caveats, right? So for provisionals, PCTs, and U.S. applications, any of those either existing or ongoing during that first year, the university covers that. We do ask that the startups start paying $500 a month at month 6 to the end of the year. And I realize in the grand scheme of things that doesn't carve into it much, but we found that actually is really critical in forcing the companies to start thinking of themselves as real companies that have real bills. So just getting them to write that check kind of helps them get into the correct mindset. We do not cover foreigns during that time. So, let's say that at the time we're signing the license, we're getting ready to enter national stage. We will pay for the U.S., but the company would have to pay upfront if they wanted to file internationally. To the point of making those payments, if the company then at 1 year can't pay the past costs and anything that's been incurred during year 1, we will negotiate a payment plan with them, but that takes the exit fee from 0.75% to 1%. So there's an increase in the exit fee if those payments aren't made at year one.
We're probably the gentlest of that I've experienced. We defer patent expenses for 3 years, and then after the third year, they're on a schedule. And of course, that's with some caveats. So let me go a little bit further. So the general principle is a 3-year deferral and then a schedule. And so the schedule is for all past patent costs and all U.S. costs during the 3-year deferral. After execution, there's startups responsible for all foreign costs.
Great, thank you all so much. We have a lot of other questions from the audience, so maybe we can move on for patent expenses. One of the questions actually was, what proportion of faculty startups do actually take the express licenses, and what proportion actually choose to negotiate from scratch? Do you have approximate percentages from each of your institutions on that?
So, Kirsten, I did pull some numbers beforehand, but I don't think I'm going to answer the question directly with a hard percentage. But
okay.
And this data is a few months old, but you guys can do back of the envelope math here. We've done 86 startup licenses over the period since we started the Express license, and 62 of those have been the Carolina Express. Now, that being said, the ones that were not Carolina Express were not necessarily because the faculty member didn't want to take it, right? A lot of them are co-owned inventions with other institutions, and one of our policies is that we are not obligated to provide the Carolina Express when we have co-owners, because obviously we don't want to obligate another institution to those rates. We've also had a few caveats with, say, companies that were more service companies, and frankly, that type of business model just doesn't fit well with the Carolina Express. I think that's something we're thinking about maybe addressing in the future. I think one of my most entertaining experiences is I did have one faculty member refuse to do the Carolina Express, and it was because he wanted his fair share of inventor revenue when the company did well, and so he wanted his own company to pay maximum royalties and maximum rates. So he told me he wanted me to really negotiate hard against his own company, which I thought was pretty funny. So I would say in the grand scheme of things, most of our licenses, and I would say 90% plus, our folks are going with the Express license.
That's really helpful. Ken and John, do you have any similar numbers?
Don't have any, no official numbers, but I would say that outside of therapeutics, where we don't offer the startup license, one of the requirements is that one of the founders has to be, from Yale. So a student or faculty member who's going to participate as a founder, and it's usually them that are bringing the license to us, or bringing the company to us. So if a startup from the outside world is coming and they just say, we want this license, the answer is going to be no. So it really needs to include a Yale founder. But I would say outside of therapeutics now, probably like 90% of our of our licenses to Yale startups are using this. I think there's very few that are negotiated de novo.
Yeah. And Ken, you had said most.
Right, almost all.
Almost all, great. And then one of the other questions I think is tangentially related to this was someone asked about, have you seen an increased number of rate of amendments with express licenses or not?
No, I mean, I think we've all joked, right? You're doing a license and you might as well just start drafting the amendment, right? The First Amendment.
Right.
I think that's pretty much been the same, whether it's an express license or any other, right? Because you're dealing with things, there's an investor that comes on board and they want something, or we've identified a sub-licensee and they have some particular caveat. So no, I think it's just the nature of the beast, frankly.
I'd actually say that very few of our, there certainly have been some amendments, but I'd say relatively few, especially compared to companies that have not used the startup license, other startups, especially in therapeutics, where they fall behind in patent expenses or some other payments and they want to renegotiate. We've had other companies come to us and ask, hey, we'd like to have those same terms, and generally the answer is no. So.
So I think I'll follow on that because I see there's a question in here about does anyone use Express for therapeutics? And I guess this might be an important point in, comparing John's answer to my answer, is that UNC is unique. I think a lot of its peers in that it does not have a school of engineering, and I would say 80% plus of the technologies that we're working with are therapeutic based or life science based. So our Carolina Express is tailored to licensing therapeutics, where we're going to see kind of that need for amendments based upon issues that have arisen with manufacturing or early clinical trials and that kind of thing. So it is a little bit of some different circumstances to deal with there.
So the big one that I've had experience with are when VCs get involved in later rounds and they really don't like the exit fee. And so the challenge is trying to come up with something to balance the loss of the exit fee versus just losing it.
Yeah.
So Ken, are they willing to negotiate, just a straight equity deal in exchange
As we know,
for taking the equity out?
All VCs would like the deal to be for zero compensation, but that's what they try. So, Kirsten, what should we do?
I will. I'm going to just be a moderator today, I think. We actually have a lot of questions from our audience, and I really do want to get to those, considering I know people only have a certain amount of time that they allotted to this webinar. So I'd like to get to we have a couple questions about equity. However, I don't think that, at least Ken and Kelly, you do the exit fee versus the equity. Is that correct? Because we have questions about how whether you share the equity with the faculty founders in these cases, and also how anti-dilution would work if there was anti-dilution associated with these startup equity deals. So, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
I can give a really quick answer about the equity sharing because we treat the exit fee the same way. So we have a policy, a state policy, that inventors are not allowed to quote unquote double dip. So they cannot have equity in the company and also receive a share of equity payouts to the university. And we treat the exit fee as equity. So our founders do not receive a portion of exit fees or equity. The rest of the inventors would that are not founders in the startup.
Mm-hmm. We actually take equity in addition to the exit fees, so 6% founder share, but we allow the faculty to double dip, and we share 50% with inventors.
John, did you want to comment on that one at all, or? So our exit fee is it's 1% of the final transaction, but there's a cap at $1 million. And then a floor of $25,000. So, I think if you were to have some huge exit, I think investors are comfortable that we're not, taking an enormous amount. And there's no anti-dilution. Any equity that Yale has in the company outside of the license, for example, if we're working as a founder, would be creditable against the exit fee. And again, we have this sort of discount if they make payments on time, which generally nobody ever does. So.
Right. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we still have 14 open questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through each one of these and not necessarily, I'm just going to run through them in order because I want to get through as many as possible. This first one actually should provide you can each provide a very short answer. It says, for the base of your royalty calculation, do you use net sales or gross sales? John?
It's net sales.
Ken?
Net.
And
net sales, but with really tight exclusions.
Great.
Net sales.
Okay, terrific. Next question. Has this created an increased number of patents being generated and deals being signed? If so, how are potentially your increased patent costs being dealt with?
I'll just start. So it has not resulted in an increased number of patents being filed. This
is Yale, yeah.
But it has resulted in an increased number of deals being done. And I would say that, because we're getting an increased number of deals, we're getting more of our patent expenses reimbursed overall. I don't know that these startups are any better or worse than any other companies at reimbursing. So that's always going to be, kind of an issue, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to just echo most of that and say that, frankly, when it comes to patent costs, you have to manage them like all other licensees. If they start not paying, then at some point we're going to start, not pursuing certain applications. And so I think we've monitored that closely internally.
As far as activity, when I was at Calgary, we went from 1 to 2 startups a year to 6 to 8 when we went to the express term, so lots more activity. And here at Maryland, the patent costs are, since we're so gentle and we defer them for so long, we view that as an investment in our startups. But since we are also getting increased activity, we had 8 startups last year, and maybe we'll plateau at a dozen or 15. We have to make sure that we have the funds to support those investments.
Mm-hmm.
And may have to adjust accordingly.
Kelly, I'm going to direct this next question just to you because it says, for those who had an express license program for a long time, and you're the longest, have you seen a large number of deals where the university really lost out due to offering less rich terms in the express license than you potentially would have in a standard license? And do you use the express license only for startups that aren't likely to provide a larger term?
So the express license is available to all of our startups for which we have a university founder, regardless of whether or not it looks to be a hot market or not. It's hard to argue negative data, right? And maybe what would have happened, or frankly, startups that maybe would have never moved forward or gotten traction if we didn't have the express license. One thing I will say is I do think, and we are having this conversation currently about updating our terms. So, we were negotiating the Carolina Express license in 2008, 2009. I don't know if everybody's put this out of their memory yet, but that wasn't exactly the most promising of financial times. And so our rates somewhat reflect that. And so we are having conversations about what kind of process to put in place to still offer low and fair rates that incentivize our inventors to start companies, but that maybe are more reflective of the current market. So yeah, I do think that there has to be some thought put into what those rates are and periods at which they should be reevaluated.
Great, thanks. It's really helpful. I think especially to people looking to start their own programs. The next question has to do with the extended negotiation time. Are you finding that the delay and pushback is coming more from the startup team on the financial terms or from the attorneys negotiating the legal terms still on these express licenses? And have these actually addressed those issues? And comment on both, perhaps. John?
Yeah.
So I think that this is definitely reduced negotiation time. It's reduced our burden in trying to get these companies out the door. I think that we don't have a formal review process. We kind of visit things kind of on an ad hoc basis, but I think overall it's been incredibly effective.
So I'll step in here and just say, go ahead.
No. Sorry, Kelly, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think this is one of the things that we got right at the beginning of this process. We spent a lot of time negotiating the original express license, and part of the reason it took quite a while to negotiate was because we brought the major attorneys in our area that were representing our startups to the table, and we also brought local VCs to the table and negotiated a deal up front that all of them agreed that they would tell their clients that they would fully support. So, that really eliminated most of the negotiation from the startup's attorneys, et cetera, because we had worked with them to get agreement that they would endorse up front.
Great.
I'd just like to say that we all benefit from all that work that you did, Kelly. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for taking the lead. One of the people wrote in asking if you can point to any successful startup company launches that wouldn't have happened. The absence of this you wouldn't have had this particular startup.
Yeah, I can point to several. Some of you may have seen a press release the other day from a company called Spring Health. This is based on an algorithm developed by a psychology grad student here at Yale who it basically came up with an app that can predict response to SSRIs. They've just raised a $22 million A round. They already have some customers, and looks like they're off to the races. We have another one called Isoplexis, which I think has raised something like, I don't know, $80 million totally in total to date. We're looking for an exit from them within the next year or so. There have been, I think, a number of companies, again, outside of therapeutics that have had some pretty good successes, although none that I can think of that have had a blockbuster IPO or product launch. But certainly some that have done pretty well in terms of raising venture capital and advancing the technology.
Anyone else want to mention a particular success? Hearing none, we'll move on to the next question. Someone asked about the reimbursement models that you have for your patent expenses. There are a lot of questions about those patent expenses. How is this is it actually working? Are you getting paid? Or are there a lot of defaults?
I'd say no more or less than any other startup company.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Ken?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, great. Next question then is, who decides when you utilize the express license versus the fully negotiated license, or is there some kind of guidelines already that's out for this when it can be used? So who's the decision maker? And then also going along with that question, how many of these companies have that have used these express licenses have had successful follow-on fundings? John, you just talked about a couple yourself.
Yeah. So for Yale, we have the criteria for eligibility for the express license on our website. So if it involves at least one member of the founding team who is within the Yale community, faculty, employee, or student, and it's outside of therapeutics, they have to have provided us with a reasonable business plan, and then it's really their election if they want the startup license or if they want to come and negotiate it.
Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, kind of along those lines. As far as the maturity of the business, we don't have a threshold for capitalization or anything like that, but we don't negotiate with faculty, and so that necessitates that a business partner have been brought along, and so that's a relatively mature startup.
Yeah, I would say that's probably one of the biggest advantages of what we feel is a big advantage of our approach is that they don't have to have identified an entrepreneur to get a license. And because it's non-negotiable, the faculty are not placed in a situation where there would be a conflict of commitment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I guess, too, Kirsten, I wanted to follow on with a point to one of the prior questions on patent costs, because this occurred to me. This is really important for us, is that, for startups that are negotiating a full license agreement, they're now paying an attorney for hours and hours of negotiation, right? So what the money they do have is going to the attorney as opposed to actually reimbursing us for patent costs. So we have found that to be, advantageous, that they can actually use those funds for something we want them to use them for, not to pay someone else to negotiate against us.
Mm-hmm. We're going to go to the next question, which I think basically is asking if the startup does not use the express license, what perhaps this person has found is that potentially now you've already set some terms and they want to negotiate against those terms and get an even more favorable deal. Has this been an issue at all at any of your institutions? Ken, you want to start out?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
how do you handle it?
Well, we have our terms are. So essentially, for example, we take equity and an exit fee. So that seems relatively rich, but really the advantage of our license is it's extremely backloaded. The royalty holiday and the deferred patent costs, and so it takes a while to make the team understand that even though looking at face value at the numbers, it seems more like a market deal, that it's really very favorable because of the delayed nature of any collections.
Right.
Yeah, it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Kelly? You said that when you put standard terms in front of a company, that they immediately snap back to the express model. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, actually, I think it's the other way. We snap. They say they don't want to do an express license. We snap back to a market rate. So I would say very early on in the process, we would either have founders want to negotiate something and start at the express license rate, or we would have non-startups come in and present the express license, rev financials. And, our response to that was, try again. We're not even going to mark this up. Like, until you bring us a real term sheet, we're not even going to have a conversation with you. And so I feel like those conversations ended pretty quickly. Like, I don't deal with that almost ever anymore, because it's very clear and understood that that's not acceptable. You either take the express license or we're going to go to standard rate.
Yeah, in our experience since we implemented this program, I can't think of an instance where we got pushback and they said we would prefer to go and negotiate from scratch. In some cases we might see some redlining, and then we just say, look, it's non-negotiable. If you don't accept these terms as is, we're going to start negotiating from scratch. We have had some faculty that have taken the startup license, and then we get pushback after it's executed. They want to come back and do amendments. And, of course, as Kelly alluded to, as soon as you sign it, you should be starting to expect amendments. So.
Great, thanks. We actually have a number of more questions, so I think we may go over time. People can drop off as they need to, but I do want to get to as many of these questions as we can. The next question is, do the non-founding inventors have a say in whether the use of an express license is applicable? So those people who are not perhaps involved in the startup, do they have any say in how this process works, or how has that actually been played out at your institutions? Ken, have you experienced that?
If you mean like for IP that's brought in after the founding, no.
Actually, I think it's talking about the inventors who perhaps are not associated with the startup company but are involved with the intellectual property that's being licensed to this to the company, whether an express license is used or not, whether they have any say in that.
No.
Yeah, we're generally going to defer to the PI, the head of the lab. So if it's their company, generally what they say, what they just determine that they want, we're going to follow. If in some cases we've had students come to us and ask, can we license this technology from Professor Smith's lab? We'll of course check with Professor Smith. Are you comfortable with this? And if they say yes, then we go ahead. Okay.
Great. We're going to, since we're just about running out of what our planned time was, we're going to actually put up a really short survey in the chat box. For those of you who are on here, if you could answer this survey, we'd really appreciate it. This feedback actually helps inform us how our webinars perform, but also what we do on future webinars. So we're going to keep this up to anyone who's still listening to this. Looks like we still have 150 people in this. But we'd like to get to a few more questions. John, Kelly, and Ken, can you stay for a few more minutes to answer some more questions?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So we have the question of what level of investment is required before executing the license. Ken and Kelly, I'm not actually sure that that actually applies to your licenses. John, it sounds like it does potentially for yours.
No, we don't require any kind of minimum investment, but we just advise the startup teams that as soon as they sign, they're going to become liable for certain expenses. So just be prepared to pay those, and it's better if they have a financing than if they're going to have to dig into their pockets. So,
yeah. I mean, we do typically include a minimum amount of financing as the first due diligence requirement under the license. But it's not required to execute, but it is one of the due diligence requirements for the license. Yeah.
I should point out also, since you mentioned due diligence, I mean, essentially our due diligence is the requirement to make payments. And, there's a clause in there about reasonable commercial efforts, but essentially, there's an annual fee. And reimbursement of past patent expenses, which in some cases can be pretty substantial. The annual fee escalates up to about $40,000 annually. So if a company is not financed, that's going to put, serious pressure on the founders to come up with the money for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just for clarity from UNC's perspective, given that most of ours are therapeutics, most of the due diligence milestones are around clinical advancement. So that's why there's this kind of couple of things at the front end that may be around solidifying a management team or some minimum amount of financing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at College Park, we don't have a medical school, so there aren't very many therapeutics or clinical trials associated with our startups. Some, but not many. And so we have put a lot of effort in coming up with verifiable development milestones included in the licenses, but no capitalization requirements.
All right, great. So the next question was, how do you make the decision to enter into an express faculty-founded license versus a license to a third-party entity, if there is that potential ability to do one or the other?
Again, I think there Yale would defer to the wishes of the principal investigator whose lab this came from, you know, if they're part of the company, or if you know, they've already said yes, well, you know, they're okay with this being licensed to a student startup team, then that's the way we'll go.
Kelly?
So I think for us, it's more of a unit-based conversation, dependent upon what we think the market is, what we think is actually what would give the technology the best chance for success. Mm-hmm. But then, you know, in reality, there's also academic politics that come into play. So we're not playing blind to that either. So we've had it happen a few times, and it is a delicate situation. But we do try to weigh a number of things in before making the decision.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that, Kelly. But we try to pick the best path forward for development of the research into products and services, and so try to put that in front of any founding team that, you know, weigh the risks of a startup against the risk of a license if it's possible to license the technology.
You know, I will say though that it's been interesting. I've had a couple of situations where faculty were very motivated by the financials, and we actually sat down with them and ran, you know, numbers of what they might be paid out in equity versus a royalty revenue from a particular company. We've had several situations where the faculty said, okay, let's do a third-party license. So we've had come into that situation a few times as well.
Our next question was, if you license more than one patent or technology, does that affect your terms? Ken?
No.
Nope. Kelly?
Nope.
John?
Nope.
All right, great. That was easy. The next question probably is not a yes or no. It's not a yes or no question. It's about the feedback from the investment community. How has that been on your particular express licenses? John, do we want to start out with you on this one?
You know, I think the investors for these kinds of licenses are typically different than, for example, a startup around therapeutics. So we don't see the kind of big A-round investors in these companies, although that is changing, I think, somewhat, usually after the company has gone out perhaps with a seed round from local investors or angels or maybe an SBIR, and they have some, you know, pretty good demonstration of progress, and they might get larger investors interested. So, you know, I don't think we're getting the feedback from the typical big top-tier investors, VC firms, but, you know, I think in general it's been pretty positive.
Ken?
Just around the exit fee when they see that as equity investment with unlimited anti-dilution, and they just don't like that in principle, even though it's a very small amount.
Kelly?
So I think back to kind of how this whole thing started, we had buy-in from local VCs since they were very supportive. And you know, obviously they're typically involved in a lot of those rounds, and we've had some very, very large Series A's and then follow-on rounds with our startups. And you know, we argue about all the typical things, but actually they've been very, very supportive and accommodating of the express license.
Great. So the next question is about, I think it's really about earned royalties. Have you actually received earned royalties? What percentage of the companies have returned revenue based on royalties to the office? I mean, most of these programs haven't been around that long, or even if they've been around for 10 years, still usually products are not right around the corner.
Yeah, we're a bad example for this because, like I said, we're a therapeutic-based office.
Right.
So, yeah, 10 years we're just starting to see things from 10 years ago come to fruition. So ask me in another 2 to 3 years.
Okay. John?
Yeah. I don't think we've had too many where they've gotten to the point of having products on the market and are making sales. But certainly we've seen some companies making milestone payments, making annual minimum payments, reimbursing patent expenses, et cetera. So I think in the next couple of years, we'll see the first 1 or 2 large exits under the startup license program. So ask me in a year.
This is Ken. None in Maryland. We've only been doing it a year. But when I was in Calgary, we included quarterly reporting and a 1% royalty on gross sales. And the reason was, it's hard to argue that 1% royalty is not a discount no matter what sector. But also asking for the quarterly reports. The notion was that it's hard to get companies to report, but if they owe a fee, if they owe a royalty, then if they have to cut a check, then they'll include a report. And we found that to be the case as soon as sales happen.
Great. So one of the questions that was actually asked before the webinar that we hadn't gotten to yet was about the exit or liquidation payments versus taking equity in the company. Especially, I guess, Kelly, but for those of you who have this exit source success fee versus the equity, has it simplified the negotiation? Or do you think what do you think experience has been with that?
So, yeah, I think for us, a big reason we initially went with the exit fee versus equity was because we were trying to navigate shareholders agreements and all these other documents with companies that maybe had the scientist as a founder, and it just was turning into an administrative nightmare, and with startups in the therapeutic space that had a very high failure rate. So it didn't seem like an intelligent investment for effort, and so the exit fee certainly made that easier. The problem, and I know that we discussed this amongst ourselves earlier, the problem with the exit fee is that even though you can have it survive termination, it's harder to kind of hold companies' feet to the fire and whether or not you want to litigate to get paid. So, certainly one conversation that we've had internally, there's no movement this way, but we've discussed whether or not it would make sense to start with an exit fee and then perhaps convert to actual equity at some, amount of trigger financing when there was actually, investors involved and people who knew how to pull those things together. So that's just one idea on the table at this point.
I am curious, actually, have you had any exit fees actually triggered by these licenses? Let's start with Kelly, but
yeah, we've had 1 or 2, not a ton.
Yeah. One of the things that actually another person had asked about was actually about if you do take equity under these express licenses, do you have extended negotiations over the shareholders agreements themselves? Ken, maybe you can answer this one since you do both.
Yeah, they have to comply with Maryland law. We're a state institution, but that's about as far as we push it.
And is it otherwise? So otherwise, it doesn't take a long time on these SPAs or IRAs.
Right.
Okay. John, do you have any experience with this as well, or is that?
So we're not taking equity
right.
in the license. We just have the exit fee. Depending on the how extensively involved we've been with the startup team, we might tell them we expect a certain % of equity in the founders agreement, and but really the purpose for doing the startup license without equity was because we didn't want to be seen as being sort of greedy or overbearing or exerting power over students or that kind of thing.
Right. There is one very long question yet left that I'm not sure that we really have the time to get into because I think it would be quite long, and we are already quite a bit over time. But maybe something we can follow up on with people and answer when we send everyone the slides from this. So we just got one more question. We will follow up with this person directly on the answer to these questions because we've already kept everyone 10 minutes over time. We really appreciate everyone joining today. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, John, Ken, and Kelly, for this obviously a topic that people are very interested in, and for sharing your experiences. And I'm sure there's honestly a lot more we could have answered today. I hope that people do write to you perhaps with some follow-up questions based on the email addresses obviously we have on this last slide here. So thank you again for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for joining us as well. Enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.